right now. I just did my MCAT, my application goes in this week. So hopefully, if I come back again, I can be like, I'm in med school now. No, that's fine. I just wanted to, say I'm not a grad student. But I did graduate with a degree in behavioral neuroscience. I've studied a lot of psychology and a lot about mental illness. And I also am a Harry Potter enthusiast. So that's actually was on here before I saw Mandy's talk. So that was really exciting that she gave that talk today. So yeah, I'm here to talk to you. How many of you have heard this argument be made or read it in a forum, seen someone argue on a Facebook thread that religion is a mental illness, maybe that it's a delusion, hallucinations, or maybe you've even made the argument yourself? Yeah, so about half the room has seen this. I just wanted to clarify that this is actually something that a lot of people say. Richard Dawkins has some excellent quotes on why he calls it a hereditary mental illness, which is interesting in its own way. And there's also this Facebook page. It's hard to read it there, but the title of this public page is "Religion is a Mental Disorder." At the time I took the screenshot, it was about 1,600 likes. I checked this morning, it's just over 2,400 now. So this is a fairly popular opinion that the non-religious population has. So this kind of started off, we had these headlines, and this is what really made this argument grow. Religious fundamentalism may be categorized as a mental illness, experts say. Kathleen Taylor, neuroscientist, says religious fundamentalism could be treated as a mental illness. So people took these headlines, ran with them, and said, look, neuroscientists are saying that we can treat religion as a mental illness. Well, no, that's not what anybody says. At least neuroscientists are not saying this. So, as you can see in the headline, Kathleen Taylor specifically said religious fundamentalism. She's not saying your average God-believing theist would be treated for a mental illness. And here's her actual quote. She said that someone who has, for example, become radicalized to a cult ideology, we might stop seeing that as a personal choice that they have chosen as a result of pure free will, and we may start treating it as some kind of mental disturbance. So this was not a talk that Kathleen gave. This was during a Q&A session, something that she just said in passing. She said, yeah, sure, maybe someday we'll have some therapy that we can treat religious fundamentalists. And she even said that we could take someone who has this deeply held belief that maybe something like beating my child is okay, and we can sit down with these people and actually maybe treat them instead of just punishing them, sending them to jail, whatever, which I think is an excellent idea. I think it's way in our future, but that's really what she was trying to say here. She was not trying to argue that religion in and of itself is a mental disorder, but people did take her words and spin them and kind of run with that argument, trying to say that scientists were arguing this as well. So I kind of want to clarify, and I know our previous speaker, he also had a slide that was talking about, here's what I'm not saying. So just to clarify, I'm not saying that religion is not related to mental illness or that it doesn't impact people who already have a mental illness. I think it's very strongly related. Our culture definitely impacts delusions that people hold. And and even so, people who struggle with depression, possibly the worst thing you could do is say, that's your fault. You've been feeling so bad. But that's exactly what religion does. A lot of times somebody will go to their pastor and they say, I've been feeling depressed, I've been feeling really down, I don't know what's wrong with me. Well, that's your fault. God is punishing you in some way. You need to pray more, you need to come to church more. And that making somebody feel guilty is the worst thing you can do. When somebody's already probably blaming themselves for symptoms that are physical and are not their fault at all. So I think religion can impact mental illness. I think that's a very important distinction to make there. And some of you might be familiar with Dr. Daryl Ray from Kansas City. He has a book called The God Virus. And what he's doing here is he's got a really great analogy for how religion spreads and how religious ideas, even if we're not religious, spread through our society and kind of infect us in a way. And I totally agree with him. I think it's a really great analogy, a really great metaphor. So I'm not trying to shoot that idea down either. So my whole point is that religion, in and of itself, believing in a God, is not an illness. So let's talk a little bit about what a mental illness is first. Mental illness can describe a wide range of disorders that affect our mood, our thinking, our behavior. It includes all sorts of illnesses, so depression, anxiety, bipolar disorders, schizophrenia, eating disorders. There's a very wide range. And the main thing about these illnesses is that not only do people have a certain set of symptoms that they're showing and they've had it for a specific amount of time, but this is impairing their functioning. So they may be unable to work, maybe impairing their social functioning, going out, being with friends, interacting with people. It's a very important part of diagnosing mental illness. And right now we use the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, that's the DSM, and we're in the 5th edition right now. So one of the number one things I hear is that religious people are believing in things that aren't real. They are believing in things that they don't have evidence for. So they're delusional. Can we diagnose them with delusions? Well, a delusion, there are kind of 2 different ways to look at a delusion. So according to the DSM-5 that I just showed you, delusions are deemed bizarre if they are clearly implausible, which we might argue believing in God is implausible, and not understandable to same culture peers, and do not derive from ordinary life experiences. So right there, the DSM-5 just cuts that out, because I think in our culture today, believing in God is a pretty ordinary life experience. Many people around us are experiencing that. You're not going to be able to diagnose it, if you're using the DSM-5. Here's Wikipedia. Very professional. A delusion is a belief held with a strong conviction, despite superior evidence to the contrary. Well, sure, I would argue that under that definition, somebody who believes in God is under a delusion. They have very strong conviction, and they aren't really listening to any evidence that we provide them. But Wikipedia goes on, as a pathology, which is something you would diagnose, it is distinct from a belief based on false or incomplete information, confabulation, dogma, illusion, or other effects of perception. So again, and I think this is a really important distinction to make, we can call people who are religious delusional, I will give you that, but we have to draw the line. What is a delusion with the everyday definition that we use it, and what is a delusion that we can actually diagnose, that is a pathology in one's mind, and that is not what believing in God is. It's not something diagnosable. So here are some examples of delusion as a pathology. So maybe somebody who suffers from schizophrenia, they have this idea in their mind that the government is watching their home because the FBI needs their ideas. They have very important ideas that only they know, and the FBI needs them from them. That is something they have no evidence for. Nobody has come to them and is telling them, hey, the FBI really wants your ideas. You've got great ideas. This is coming from within. In manic states, somebody might be having, delusions of grandeur. So they may think that they're a deity, that they're a god. And while you might say, that's kind of a gray area between religion and mental illness, like I said, our culture, our beliefs can impact the delusions that we have. So, if you're a person who's religious, those ideas can really impact a brain that's making loose connections in there. So there's absolutely no doubt when somebody has a pathological delusion. No doubt in their mind that this is true. So an example might be believing aliens planted a chip in your brain. There's no evidence, right? We could scan the person's brain, we could show them, there's no chip in there, no evidence was left behind, nobody saw these aliens come down, or somebody's believing that the government bugged their house and is listening to all their conversations. Again, we could sweep their house and show them there's no evidence and nobody has come and said these things to you. It's just not true. It's coming from within. What about somebody believing there's a supernatural, all-knowing being who hears prayers and works in mysterious ways, is invisible, undetectable? Well, there's no real evidence for that. But people who believe this, they have their pastors, their priests, who they've grown up listening to, who are teaching this to them as truths. They have their family, their friends reinforcing all these ideas around them. And that's something that somebody who may suffer from schizophrenia or other psychosis, that they don't really have that. They don't have this reinforcement around them saying, yeah, man, aliens probably put a chip in your brain and you're, really struggling with that. But, religious people do have these reinforcements around them. But you might say, religious people say God speaks to them. They're hearing voices. Can we call that a hallucination if they're hearing things that aren't real? Well, when somebody says, God speaks to me, I think, first off, our minds are set for pattern recognition. We as humans, our brains, we're not perfect at all. And when we hear we can hear and see things that maybe we've kind of been primed for. And I'll give you an example. So say you've watched a scary movie, horror film, and then you go back home, you're in your house alone, the light is dark, and you see something in the doorway, and suddenly your mind thinks that's a body. You have somebody standing in my doorway, but then you realize, oh, it's just like a coat on a hanger. Your mind was primed to see something, to recognize a pattern right there. You were on edge already. You saw what your mind wanted you to see, and then you realize, oh wait, that was actually something different. So I like to think of religious individuals as having their minds primed to hear voices, to hear God's voice, and to look for these signs that God is speaking to them. They want to hear that voice. They are seeking God's voice. So maybe they hear a song on the radio and they think that's God speaking to them. So that's one thing. Or maybe they heard a whisper in the wind when they're sitting outside praying to themselves. They want that to have been God's voice. And they start thinking, oh, maybe, was that it? Did I just hear God speak to me? And then they go tell their friends, hey, I think God spoke to me today. And you know what that friend's going to do? They're going to say, that's awesome, that's amazing, God spoke to you today. And they're going to reinforce that. And then that person from then on is going to think, yeah, God really spoke to me that day. So positively reinforced in their community. Auditory hallucinations aren't sought out like that. People who hear voices, they happen from within the brain. I'm going to go on a little neuroscience tangent because I really like it. So what happens in auditory hallucinations, the same part of your brain that lights up when somebody is actually speaking to you lights up when somebody's having an auditory hallucination. It's very different from the part of the brain that lights up, and I say lights up, I mean under like an fMRI scan. Your brain isn't actually lighting up, you get it. But the part of your brain that you're using when, you're thinking to yourself, you know what your conscious sounds like when you hear a voice talking to you. It's totally different with an auditory hallucination. Your brain is tricking you into thinking that somebody's actually talking to you. You think you're hearing it. There's no difference. There's no real way for a person to tell. So our brains can be really mean sometimes. And I don't think that that's what's happening when religious folks are saying that God speaks to them. Now, sometimes people do hear these voices and they attribute that to God, and that's another one of those kind of gray areas where religion is impacting, or culture is impacting that illness that is already there. So I think the biggest takeaway that I want to get here is that somebody can be irrational, and I think we're all irrational at times. But that doesn't mean that you're mentally ill. Yeah, people who are religious have the capacity to be rational, but sometimes mental illness takes that capacity away. People aren't looking for those hallucinations. They don't believe those delusions, they don't want to. It's just there. And I think religious people are more seeking out that delusion. They want to believe it's true, so they're really not going to want to listen to evidence to the contrary. So not only is this argument wrong, it's also insulting. Not just to religious people when we call them crazy or whatever, but when we start using our mental illness as an insult towards people, it shuts down the conversation, and it is terribly insulting to people who actually suffer from a mental illness. When we start using their illness as an insult to others, there's already a stigma on people with mental illness. People already don't want to come out and say, yeah, I live with depression. Yeah, I have bipolar disorder. Because they don't want to be written off as crazy. They want you to listen to them and listen to their experiences. And it's not fair to them when we go around calling people crazy as an insult. We should stop. And we can do better. We can have conversations with people, and I'll read this little quote to you. This is the kid president. I think he's adorable. He says, "I disagree with you, but I still like you as a person who is a human being, and I will treat you like that, because if I didn't, it would make everything bad." And that's what lots of people do, and it's lame. He speaks the truth. He puts it simply, and it's true. We have to stop that. Claiming that a Christian is mentally ill, it's an entire conversation stopper. You're not going to get anywhere with that. If you want to find some common ground with somebody, really listen to their experiences and stop trying to shut them down automatically. So that's all I have. Thank you.